Oh, it's a message from somebody who watches my videos. I get these kind of questions all the time. Andy, I have found clay in my backyard, but every time I try to make something with it, it cracks. What am I doing wrong? So a lot of people have this problem. They find some clay, but then it isn't what they expected. It isn't what they hoped for. It's lacking in plasticity. Maybe it's kind of gritty, or maybe it's really sticky. There's a broad range of qualities in clays, and the type that we're looking for to make pottery with is just a narrow window within that range. Let's talk about how we can take clays that aren't really usable and make them usable for making pottery. First of all, I want to emphasize to everybody that not all wild clay is usable for making pottery. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's something less than 50% of all the clays out there in nature are actually going to be usable for making pottery. So there's a pretty good chance that when you first go out to find clay and you find some and bring it home, that it's not going to be really that good for making pottery with. So keep that in mind, that maybe some clays just can't be fixed. Now let's talk about what those properties are we're looking for in clay. Those properties that make clay desirable for pottery. So there's actually a lot of them, and a lot of these are kind of subjective based on the potter. But here's the main ones, the big ones, right? The first one is plasticity, and that's where you see me in some of those videos. I'll talk about wrapping a little coil of clay around your finger. That's a plasticity test. That's just seeing how plastic the clay is, how moldable it is. All of these qualities of clay are a spectrum. Imagine the spectrum of plasticity now. You've got fat clays, clays that are very plastic on one side.
Oh, that's too hot.
And lean clays, clays that lack plasticity on the other side.
That's too cold.
And what we're looking for is that little range in the middle that's really usable for pottery.
Just right.
Over here on the fat side, we've got clays that are so sticky you can hardly work them. And over here on the lean side, you've got clays that are so short, you bend them at all and they just crack. One of the other qualities we look at is shrinkage. So all clays will shrink some when they dry, but some clays shrink so much that they're hardly usable. They shrink so much that the pot will almost always crack when it dries. Or they shrink so much that you make a pot this size and you're left with a pot this size. It's hardly worth using when your pot decreases by 25%, which it can with some clays. Now that shrinkage can relate to the plasticity. In many cases, the very, very plastic or fat clays also have high shrinkage rates. And those that are lean, those that are lacking in plasticity, generally have lower shrinkage rates. The other quality I look for in clay is wet strength. So you don't want a clay that's really floppy, that when you try to build a vessel, it keeps sagging on you. And again, this is a range, this is a spectrum. On one side, you have clays that have no wet strength. They can't build anything because they just keep falling down. And then you have clays that are so firm, so rigid, that it takes great hand strength just to push them into the shape you want them in. You don't want to have to fight the clay to get it to the shape you want it in. At the same time, you want to be able to make it into a shape and have it stay in that shape. So you don't want it to be too soft or too firm. You want it in the middle there that has good wet strength for building. So now that we've got the spectrum of qualities in mind that we're looking for, plasticity, shrinkage, and wet strength, let's talk about how we can kind of cope with clays that don't fit into that range, how we can maybe bring them into range. So first, let's talk about overly plastic clays, clays that are considered fat clays. They're too plastic to use. We want to reduce the amount of stickiness of the clay. We want to reduce the amount of shrinkage because those generally go together. Number one thing you're going to do is add temper. Temper is any non-plastic material you add to the clay. Temper is important in most all clays, so you want to use some kind of a non-plastic particle like sand, or volcanic ash, or ground up pottery, what we call grog, something that's not going to be plastic that you're going to add to it. It's going to break up those little particles that are really tight and make it less plastic. Now let's talk about the other side of that spectrum, the lean clays, those that are lacking in plasticity. Those clays that when you try to bend them, they just want to crack. In this case, oftentimes the cause is you already have naturally occurring temper in there. You already have non-plastic material in your clay in great quantities. So one of the things you can do is purify that clay. You can pass it through a screen. You can get on Amazon, you can buy really, really fine mesh screens to pass your clay through and remove some of those larger non-plastic particles, silt-sized particles. Or you can use levigation. That's the process of putting the clay in a bucket with water, mixing it up, letting those larger particles settle to the bottom for a minute, and then pouring off that pure clay. I'll put a link to a video down in the doobly-doo all about how to do levigation. But levigation is a great way of purifying all those non-plastic materials out of your clay and improving the plasticity. There's a few other tricks you can use to increase plasticity, like adjusting the pH level. Most of those are going to make very, very minor differences in your clay. Chances are, if one of these, either adding more temper or removing those non-plastic particles through purifying the clay, if those don't bring it within the range, you're probably not going to make that big of a difference with any of those other tricks either. So let's talk about wet strength. If your clay is too soft, it is lacking in wet strength, then adding temper can increase the wet strength of that clay. On the other hand, if your clay is too firm, then probably your only choice is mixing in a softer clay with it, which is also really the best alternative for clay that is too soft as well. So if your clay is too soft, the best thing you can do for it is to mix it with another clay that has lots of wet strength. And the same goes for the other side of the spectrum. Now let's talk about that shrinkage rate. Let's talk about clays that have too much shrinkage. And in a lot of cases, as I said, these clays with high shrinkage are often your overly plastic clays as well. And so the same answer works for that as works for the plasticity, and that is adding temper. So adding some temper can really bring that shrinkage rate down. On the other hand, if your clay has not enough shrinkage, you don't have to worry about it, because not enough shrinkage is not a problem. I mean, in a perfect world, what you want is clay that doesn't shrink at all. So if your clay doesn't have enough shrinkage, good for you. And if you added as much temper as you can to a clay that has a high shrinkage rate and you still find it's cracking, the first wild clay I ever tried turned out to be bentonite, but I didn't know it at the time. And I just kept adding more and more sand to it. I got it to the point where it was almost more sand than clay, and it was very, very difficult to build anything out of. And still, when it dried, it would crack because it just had this ridiculously high shrinkage rate. And so that may be the case with you. You may find that in the end, the shrinkage rate is still too much, or you find that your pots, no matter how nice you make them, always end up much, much smaller than you made them. And that's very frustrating because it takes a lot of work to build a large pot, a lot of work to process that clay, a lot of work to build the pot, to smooth it, and then to find it, 20% the original size can be very disheartening. If you have a clay that you like, but it has too much shrinkage, it's probably time to find another clay. Now here we come to really the two big things I want you to take away from this video, and that is, you can modify the qualities of these clays a little. You can move the needle on that spectrum a few degrees, but not a lot. You can add temper, you can purify, and you can mix in other clays. But if none of those three work for you, chances are you need to throw this clay away and go out there and find a better clay. So if this is you, if you have a terrible clay that you're gonna end up having to throw out, and you're gonna need some help finding clay in the wild, I've got just a video for you over here where I talk about the characteristics you wanna look for out in nature that tell you that there's clay present. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.